The afternoon was calm, almost too ordinary when my phone rang. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, thinking it might be my daughter or maybe a neighbor. Instead, a polite voice introduced themselves as calling from a hotel. At first, I barely paid attention. Something about confirming a reservation. I leaned against the counter, curious, waiting for them to finish. Then came the words that made my stomach drop. Mr. Carter's weekend reservation for the couple's suite. I froze, blinking, certain they had the wrong Carter. I even let out a nervous laugh, ready to correct the mistake. But the employee, so professional, read back my husband's full name, his credit card details, even the exact dates. Each word hit me like a blow I never saw coming. For a moment, I wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding. But as the facts piled up, I felt the truth pressing in on me. Richard hadn't planned a romantic escape with me. He had planned it with someone else. My heart sank so heavy I thought it might stop altogether. And yet, instead of falling apart, I went still, calm, cold, and suddenly sharper than I'd ever been. I kept my voice steady, almost polite, as I thanked the employee for the call. They had no idea they'd just detonated a bomb in the middle of my kitchen. I forced a calmness I didn't feel, because if I let even a crack show, I knew the storm inside me would spill out uncontrollably. When I hung up, the silence in the room was deafening, like the world itself had stopped to watch me process what I'd just heard. I looked around my kitchen, the mug still drying by the sink, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air, and everything felt foreign, like it all belonged to someone else's life. My life, the one I thought I had just been flipped upside down in a single phone call. My hands trembled, but not from weakness. It was the kind of tremble that comes when anger and heartbreak collide, raw and electric. It would have been easy to collapse right there, to let the tears come and flood me. But something colder moved in instead. A steeliness I didn't even know I had. I stood straighter, breathed slower, and tucked the pain neatly behind a mask of composure. If Richard thought he was clever, he was about to learn how dangerous silence could be. And that thought lit the tiniest spark inside me. When Richard walked through the door later that evening, I greeted him just as I always did. My smile was calm, my tone warm, and he never noticed the fracture behind my eyes. He hung up his jacket, kissed me on the cheek, and went on about his day as if nothing had shifted. Little did he know, everything had shifted. For me, the ground was no longer steady. It was sharp, jagged, and already shaping into a weapon. I replayed the hotel clerk's words in my mind like a song stuck on repeat. The couple's suite. I wondered if he'd rehearsed what to tell me, if he had a story lined up to cover his tracks. The arrogance of it all almost made me laugh. He thought he was the director of this play, but I had just read the script, and now I held the power to rewrite the ending. I said nothing. Not that night. Not even as we sat down for dinner where he spoke casually about work, about plans, about life as if everything were normal. My silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Because from that moment on, I knew one thing for sure. Richard had no idea who he was really dealing with. And soon, he would. That night, while clearing the dishes, I asked him about his weekend. I kept my tone casual, almost playful, as if it were just small talk. He didn't hesitate. Said he had a conference. The word rolled off his tongue so smoothly, like he'd practiced it in the mirror. I nodded, pretended to believe him, even tossed in a smile. Inside, though, I was memorizing every detail, every twitch, every lie. It was almost surreal, watching him lie to me so easily. This man I had built a life with, a home, a history, sitting across from me, fabricating stories without the faintest crack in his voice. He probably thought he was brilliant, untouchable even. But what he didn't realize was that with each word, he was tightening the rope around his own neck. Later, when he stepped into the shower, I slipped into the other room and dialed the hotel. My voice was steady, though my pulse hammered in my ears. I asked for a copy of the receipt for Mr. Carter's stay. The receptionist didn't question it. She simply confirmed the details and agreed to send it. When I hung up, I knew. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was evidence. When the receipt came through, I opened it slowly, almost ceremonially, as if bracing myself for the final blow. There it was in black and white, his name, the dates, the special couples package. My chest tightened, but not from shock anymore. This wasn't disbelief, it was confirmation. Cold, undeniable proof that my husband had built his lies on top of my trust. And now, I had the paper trail to bury him with. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the document, and let the truth wash over me. The Hannah from years ago might have crumbled, might have begged for an explanation or dissolved into tears. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I'd lived too much, survived too much, to let a man's betrayal undo me. Instead, I felt something stronger harden inside, like steel being forged in fire. By the time Richard came back into the room, towel draped over his shoulders, I was calm. I smiled at him, poured his coffee, and asked about his day as though nothing had happened. He had no idea that the evidence sat hidden just a few feet away. He had no clue that the game he thought he was winning had already started to turn. That night, I lay in bed beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing as he drifted off to sleep. I stared at the ceiling, my mind spinning, not with questions anymore, but with plans. Every lie he had told me now served as fuel, feeding a fire I refused to let burn me down. If Richard thought I was blind, he was about to learn just how sharp my vision could be when I wanted clarity. I remembered the way he used to look at me, years ago, with a tenderness that made me believe we were unshakable. Where had that man gone? Or maybe he'd never truly been there at all. That thought stung, but it also cleared the fog. I wasn't grieving a love I had lost. I was uncovering the illusion of one that never really existed, and that gave me strength. As I listened to him shift in his sleep, I made a silent vow. I wouldn't confront him with tears or shouts. No, I'd be patient, deliberate, and surgical. He wouldn't see it coming, and that was the beauty of it. By the time Richard realized what I was doing, the damage would already be done. And the best part? He'd done it all to himself. The next morning, I sat at my desk with the receipt laid neatly beside me. My hands hovered over the phone for a long moment before I dialed my lawyer's number. I'd almost forgotten about the clause in our prenup. Richard was the one who had pushed for it years ago, certain he'd never be the one caught breaking it. Ironic, really. That very clause was about to become the blade I'd use against him. When my lawyer answered, I kept my tone even, almost businesslike. I explained the situation, recited the details, and forwarded the receipt. There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet assurance. This was more than enough to hold weight in court. Proof of intent, deception, and betrayal all bundled together in one neat little document. I didn't just have suspicions anymore. I had ammunition. As I listened, a strange calm settled over me. The panic and heartbreak from the day before had dulled into something sharper, steadier. This wasn't about begging for answers or clinging to what was left of us. This was about reclaiming my power. And as my lawyer walked me through the next steps, I realized Richard had already trapped himself. All I had to do was close the door. That evening, I watched him pack his suitcase. He hummed softly, folding shirts, tucking away his favorite cologne, the one he used to wear on our anniversaries. He thought he was clever, thought his story about a conference was airtight. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, and let him talk about flights and meetings. Every word he spoke was another thread unraveling, and he didn't even notice the rope tightening around him. I kept my face unreadable, my voice light. "Don't forget your charger," I said. handing it to him with the same hands that had already signed copies of legal papers. He smiled, kissed me on the cheek, completely unaware that the very woman standing in front of him was laying the foundation of his undoing. It was almost cinematic, the villain walking straight into his own trap, blind to the camera following his every move. When he zipped the suitcase shut, I snapped a photo with my phone under the guise of checking a message. Evidence. Every detail mattered now. The packed bag, the dates, the lies he repeated with ease, it all built the story that would seal his fate. And the strangest part? He still thought he was winning. After he went to bed, I sat alone in the quiet living room, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. My lawyer's words echoed in my mind. The receipt was solid proof. The lies were consistent, and the clause was ironclad. All I had to do was stay silent, keep my mask intact, and let him walk right into his own downfall. For once, time was on my side. I thought back to when we first signed that agreement. Richard had insisted on it, convinced that wealth and protection mattered more than trust. I'd gone along with it, never imagining it would one day become my shield. Now, his arrogance was my advantage. He had built the very weapon that would cut him down. As the clock ticked past midnight, I closed my eyes and pictured the weekend ahead. He thought he'd be indulging in secret champagne toasts and stolen kisses. What he didn't know was that I'd be crafting a future without him, one where his betrayal didn't break me but set me free. And soon, he'd find out just how costly that reservation truly was. The morning he left, I stood by the window and watched his car disappear down the street. To him, it was just another trip, another weekend away. To me, it was the final piece of evidence. I had already photographed his suitcase, logged the time he left, and saved every detail. Each action felt deliberate, like I was setting chess pieces on the board, step by careful step. While he checked into that hotel suite, I sat across from my lawyer, pen in hand, signing documents that would change everything. The contrast wasn't lost on me. He was sipping champagne with her, believing he was untouchable, while I was quietly rewriting the story of our marriage. Every signature was a nail in the coffin of his arrogance. I didn't feel guilt, not an ounce. What I felt was clarity, a sharpness I hadn't known in years. Betrayal has a way of burning through illusions, leaving only the truth behind. And my truth was simple. Richard had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. On Sunday evening, I set the table with care, candles lit, papers neatly stacked in the center, and a calmness draped over me like a perfectly tailored coat. When Richard walked in, suitcase in hand, he looked tired but smug, as if the world had rewarded him with some secret prize. His eyes met mine, and for a split second, I wondered if he could sense the shift in the air. He dropped his bag by the door and started talking about his conference, spinning tales about meetings and long days. I listened with a polite smile, nodding in all the right places. Then, with the gentlest gesture, I slid the folder across the table. His words caught in his throat as his gaze landed on the receipt, the hotel's confirmation, and the crisp legal papers waiting for his signature. The color drained from his face. He stammered, reaching for excuses, but his hands shook as he picked up the paper. That was the moment he realized. Every step he'd taken, every lie he'd told, had led him straight here. And I didn't have to raise my voice or shed a tear. The truth was louder than anything I could have said. I sat there, calm and steady, while Richard's face crumbled in front of me. His eyes darted from the papers to mine, searching for some trace of weakness, some sign I might give him a way out. But there was nothing left to find. I had already made peace with what needed to be done. He wasn't looking at the woman he thought he could deceive. He was looking at the one who had finally drawn the line. My lawyer spoke clearly, outlining the clause, the evidence, the consequences. Richard's mouth opened, then closed, like a man drowning who couldn't find air. He had built this life of deceit, brick by brick, and now he was watching it collapse in a single evening. The silence between us was heavy, broken only by the shuffle of papers and his shallow breaths. For the first time in years, I felt in control, not by shouting, not by begging, but by simply holding the truth in my hands. And as Richard sat there, stripped of his arrogance, I realized something. This wasn't just the end of his lies. It was the beginning of my freedom. The days that followed moved quickly, like dominoes falling one after another. Richard was forced to pack his things, not for a secret getaway this time, but for his permanent exit. The prenup he once gloated over now left him stripped bare, assets divided, accounts frozen, keys surrendered. Watching him leave wasn't painful, it was liberating. For the first time in years, the house felt like mine again. I walked through each room with a new sense of ownership. The silence that used to sting now felt like peace. No more rehearsed lies, no more sidelong glances that didn't add up. Just me, steady and whole, reclaiming every inch of space he had polluted with betrayal. Even the air seemed lighter, as though the walls themselves exhaled relief. And as for her, the woman who thought she had won some kind of prize, she vanished as quickly as she appeared. Without his money, his home, his charm polished by lies, there was nothing left for her to cling to. Let her have her silence. I had something far better: dignity, control, and the unshakable knowledge that I had ended this on my terms. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't waste another ounce of energy on a man who had gambled away the best parts of me for something so small, so fleeting. Instead, I woke up each morning with a new routine: coffee at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the windows, the quiet hum of a house that was finally mine. It wasn't loneliness I felt. It was clarity. A clarity that had been buried under years of deception. Friends called to check in, their voices cautious, expecting to hear the sound of a broken woman. But what they heard instead was steady laughter, calm responses, and a tone they hadn't heard from me in years. I wasn't surviving. I was thriving. Their surprise was almost amusing, as if dignity were some rare jewel. For me, it was a choice. A choice to walk forward without dragging his shadows behind me. Every now and then, I'd catch a memory creeping in. The vacations, the anniversaries, the small moments that used to feel so solid. But instead of pain, I felt gratitude. Gratitude that the truth had finally surfaced. Gratitude that I had been strong enough to face it head on. And gratitude that my story didn't end with his betrayal. It began with it. I often think back to that phone call, the polite hotel clerk, the simple confirmation that changed everything. What felt like the end in that moment turned out to be my beginning. The reservation for two he thought would be his secret indulgence became his undoing, his one-way ticket to ruin. And me? I walked away stronger, freer, with nothing left to hide and nothing left to lose. There's a quiet power in dignity, in refusing to let betrayal define you. I didn't need revenge served with fire or fury. My silence, my composure, my refusal to break, that was the real punishment. He had to watch me rise from the ashes he created, unscathed, while he was left scrambling in the rubble of his own lies. Now, when I close the door at night, I feel no bitterness, no regret, just peace. Richard may have made that reservation, but I was the one who truly checked out, for good. And in doing so, I discovered something I hadn't felt in years: the full weight of my own freedom and the beauty of walking into a life that was entirely mine.